Tom Rowsell, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me here, John.
Tom, I've been looking forward to the discussion. Anyone with a rich background, and you certainly got one of those as someone who has been a journalist. You've worked for the World Health Organization, of all places, very topical, I think, in this political climate. You've worked for NGOs that have supported the rights of indigenous peoples around the world. And you're also a filmmaker. You're a historian of the religious, genetic and folk histories of European peoples. And recording this from Edinburgh, I also know you have some pretty august ancestors, as it were. In fact, there's a monument to them on top of Carlton Hill in Edinburgh, which is where I record this from, the Stuarts, key figures in the Scottish Enlightenment. So quite the background. For those of you who don't know Tom, and many of you may do because he has a big YouTube footprint, is he has a channel called Survive the Jive. And I suppose within that, you can find all sorts of things. You can find you talking about and traveling around the green and pleasant land that is Britain. You can see you talking about the Vikings while standing next to the Bosphorus in Turkey and how they've used their great strength to push boats over bridges. And you can also find Tom boxing with other YouTubers at nightfall. So it's got something for everyone. But as you can imagine, dear listener, I think the question of genetics likely draws Tom some opprobrium from those who'd prefer not to believe that the English and British peoples are distinct in some way, or that there are even genetic differences amongst people. And Tom, your channel, I think, seems to be motivated about fighting the cultural amnesia that seems to have swept over the peoples of the country and perhaps more broadly in Europe, and also this culture of standardization, homogenization, and moving people around and acting as they were all the same. What is it that so you leave behind your job in science communications at WHO and the work you're doing at NGOs to focus on Survive the Jive and to bring all of this information to people at a wider audience?
Well, it was mostly just because it took off and it was financially viable for me to do this as my main job, basically. I'd already had even 10 years ago in 2013 when I was offered paid PhD position in Cambridge at Anglo-Saxon, and I turned it down because I had this feeling that I ought to be doing something a bit more. I don't want to get stuck into an academic sort of rut that studying something that no one cares about and putting getting to contribute to a journal that no one will read, and that will be my life's work. And I thought, because my previous degree in communications, I knew ways of reaching. I understood how to use social media. I've managed social media for large companies. I've worked in social media startups in Silicon Valley. So it's I knew how to make history much more popular than just what academics can. So I was kind of wanted to be an academic, but at the same time, I thought I could probably do something a bit more worthwhile in terms of with the skills I'd acquired. Then the YouTube channel at that time, 2013, Survive the Jive, was still like a hobby thing. It wasn't a big deal. And my first sort of idea then in 2013 was to make a film, From Ruins to Ruins, which was not intended to be anything to do with Survive the Jive. It wasn't even meant to be presented by me. It was meant to be presented by a Channel 4 documentary presenter, Richard Rudgley. But it was going to be a BBC production, and I was in talks with BBC over it. I was in talks with Dan Snow's organization for it for a while. But then it fell through, and I was advised by a friend at the BBC. He said, why don't you just make it yourself, because you've got this, you know how. So, and actually at the time, my video production skills weren't as good as they are now, but I knew a guy, professional video producer, who was working during the Olympics in 2012, produced some of the videos for that. Anyway, he worked with me on the film From Ruins to Ruins about the significance of the Anglo-Saxons to modern British identity. And the film, I had to present it myself because I couldn't, didn't have the budget to pay talent for it. And the film did pretty well. and I put it on pay-per-view, and I got the money back for that, spent on it. But then after that, people were like wanting more from me, and I thought people started interviewing me about it, and then like I just sort of thought I'll just use the Survivor Jive channel, chuck stuff on there, and I just started putting more on it, and I had it for a while since 2009, but it got bigger and bigger, and then by like 2019, I was able to quit my day job, so to speak.
Well, I'm sure it's a much more fascinating day job that you've got now. I'd like to get into the English and I suppose more broadly the British peoples and who they are. And I think it's fair to say that your channel rails a little bit against this notion that history started after World War II, which is most people pretty much know our history from that point, but everything before that, it's a compression of a few famous kings and queens from the Tudor period and perhaps William the Conqueror. And yet, with regards to who we are, the founding myths of the country, pagan as well as Christian, people pretty much don't really understand. But you do all sorts within your channel. You get out to the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Hebrides, and you explore the past folkways of the peoples of these British Isles. And so perhaps we go back, not necessarily to the beginning, but why don't we go back to some of those people that are the distant ancestors of the British peoples today? So apparently there is a genetic trace that you can go back to 8,000 years and that of the people who have been populating these isles. And I think most people, if they walk past a Stone Age or a Bronze Age monument, they just see it as a bunch of rocks. But where can we find traces of those early people who are the ancestors of the British peoples, and what is the significance of that today?
Well, all European people are a mixture of sort of, you can say either 4 peoples or 2 peoples, but because there was one mixing event of 2 peoples who were comprised of 2 peoples each themselves, if you know what I mean. So one is an Eastern European group, which brought Indo-European languages in the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, which are the languages that most Europeans speak today, and in fact most people it was the most widespread language family in the world. And the other are the pre-Indo-European peoples of Neolithic, the late Stone Age Europe, who they mixed with as they expanded into Western Europe. And these are the people who are responsible for building the stone circles and Neolithic stone tombs you find all around Western Europe. All Europeans descend from all these different groups. The Neolithic farmers, these people were themselves a mixture of Anatolian farmers who migrated into Europe and mixed with the indigenous Western European hunter-gatherers. The difference between Northern Europe and South Europe is that the Southern Europeans have more ancestry from the farmers, and the Northern Europeans have more ancestry from indigenous hunter-gatherers and the Indo-Europeans. The stone monuments that you can see all over England are extremely enigmatic and an important part of our identity because they're such a prominent part of the landscape. Go on Dartmoor, go in Cumbria in the Lake District, or go to the Wiltshire Plain, and you'll see fantastic monuments that are up to 5,000 years old. Those people contribute, that race rather, not necessarily the actual people who built those stones, but that Neolithic race of Western European, or the farmers of Neolithic Europe, the late Stone Age Europe, contribute almost half of the ancestry of British people, and the other half would come from the Indo-European people. But in Southern Europe, there is more like something more like 75% from the Neolithic farmers and 25% from the Indo-Europeans.
These enigmatic stone monuments that you mentioned, I think I got my first feeling of that enigmatic nature of them when in the lockdowns, the first lockdown, I was living in London. As it hit, I decided to escape back to my ancestral home of Northumberland, and decided I wasn't going back to London. It's far too lovely around here. Never really appreciated it. And I ended up setting up shop in a small village called Rothbury, which I think has an Anglo-Saxon origin to its name, but it's been around much longer. And I found myself falling in love with all of these little parts of history which showed just how long people had been populating what seemed like a small little inconsequential village. So in the church that has been standing there since the 600s, there's an Anglo-Saxon font in there with various scenes from the Bible chiseled into it. But then just up the hill, because it's hemmed in by the Coquet Valley, there's a few funerary Neolithic burial cairns, which I didn't know what they were at first. I just knew they were around. I knew they were something Stone Agey, but I didn't really know what it was. And then looked into it and thought, wow, so these people were either using them as ritualistic points. They also had standing stones, which I still don't know the full background to them. Maybe you can enlighten me, but these standing stones were used to be able to traverse the landscape, but there's something deeply geometrical about them and very precise about their location, despite there being none of our automatic calculations that we have today. And then surrounded by Hillforts, and just knowing that there were people making a living and surviving and perhaps even thriving in these places which you think are just small little sleepy Northumbrian villages was quite humbling to me, and it sent me on a bit of a journey down the exploration of the history. And I think that helped me feel a lot more rooted as a person, actually, instead of just thinking we just arrived on the spot. But what are some of these things? So let's dig into Hillforts. What are Hillforts about?
Well, I can say, before I just talk about Hillforts specifically, that the British public have their engagement with history is naturally coloured by the landscape, and the parts of the landscape that have the historical aspects of the landscape that survive are not random, because it depends on what they're made of and so on, and therefore we have a bias towards certain periods because those periods loom large in the landscape. The Neolithic world, most of it would have been, some fantastic structures made of mud and wood, all gone. We don't even know what there would have been, mostly all gone. We sometimes find evidence of it archaeologically, but the stone structures they made survive very well in parts of Britain where they haven't been turned, the stone hasn't been reused. In the eastern parts of Britain, generally, there's fewer Neolithic monuments because later in periods of history where there was less stone around, so any stone they could get, they take. But if you look up on the moors and places where it were less accessible, then you often find loads of Neolithic monuments. Then the period after that of the Bronze Age, we don't actually have, besides the only thing that stays in the landscape from the entire Bronze Age is the round barrows, which I find fascinating, but most people aren't as interested in because it's literally just a round lump of mud that's raised up. But I find that very interesting because those are first Indo-European ancestors in the island. The Iron Age, the thing that looms large on the landscape from the Celtic period in the first millennium BC, is these Hillforts, and there's literally thousands of them across Britain and Ireland, thousands in Britain. Now, what they are exactly well, no one doubts that they have military purposes because they're military fortifications, but it's also certain that they weren't just for military fortifications. They're sort of like the Iron Age equivalent of a castle, and they often developed into townships, so they became sort of trading centers and whatnot as well. But they were sometimes placed on, they're strategically military placed in a way because they're up high, but also they're sometimes not very well placed because they can be far from water sources and awkward in that defense, awkward to defend in some places as well. But they're also positioned sometimes on the middle of important trade routes, or rather cattle driving routes, such as the Ridgeway. And that indicates that they were maybe they were intended to disrupt a previous cultural system of the Bronze Age, which depended on the herding of cattle across these distances. And maybe they were ways of extracting wealth from farmers, and like you can imagine, a bit like the Motte and Baileys of the Normans were built up around the Anglo-Saxons to control the Anglo-Saxons. Perhaps the incoming Celts of the Iron Age used these hill forts as a way to subjugate the native population. It's hard to say. It's more speculative. But in the popular imagination, these hill forts are all kinds of things. In Ireland, they're often associated with the fairies. And in Britain, a lot of the hill forts have local folklore associating them with King Arthur. Everyone wants to imagine that this hill fort is Camelot. This one here is where Camelot was. And I think there's several where locals claim that Camelot. But like they have... And same with the old stone circles. Very often you have folklore around them, from connecting them to Merlin or to Christian mythology, where they say, oh, the devil threw these stones here. Or more often, these stones used to be women who didn't go to mass and say their prayers, and so they were turned into stone as a punishment. So like, because they've always been there for thousands and thousands of years, these ancient monuments have developed new histories, new meanings in the popular imagination of the British people. And they continue to do so even now, with Stonehenge being very popular, with all kinds of hippies who go there and claim that it's on a ley line, or that it's the aliens who put it there, or I don't know, whatever stuff they make up. But it's all, an ongoing process of the British people incorporating the landscape into their imaginations. And the landscape is always part of who British people are. So when British people change, they tend to try and change the way they interpret the landscape too.
You're bringing up King Arthur there. Recording this in Edinburgh, for anyone who knows Edinburgh, there's a big hulking former volcano called Arthur's Seat that overlooks the city. And what I always find remarkable, and you'll be able to shed some light on this, Tom, is that the legend of King Arthur, or perhaps the story of King Arthur, how far it was able to travel, given its origins in, the southwest of the islands, and yet here it is, being the Arthurian name being attached to an old volcano looking over the city of Edinburgh. How is it that in a world without mass communication, and even in some respects, one overarching sovereign and way of disseminating information and myths, that these things manage to almost leach into the soil and stay with us through the generations?
Well, there are many people who argue that King Arthur was a real person who lived in the Dark Ages at the time of the fall of Rome and fought against the Anglo-Saxons. There's some evidence that there are a few candidates of people who could be Arthur. That's rather besides the point, because the actual Arthurian romantic phenomenon is 1,000 years later, in the High Middle Ages. So you're not talking about the 400s, you're talking about the 1400s. And that is what Arthur is. He's like the Star Wars of the time. And most of the really important literature, or Arthurian literature, was being written in France, and it's French literature. And it's in the style of the romantic or European romance, which is the start of the novel, and it's very influential on the entire European literary tradition. This is very different to, say, earlier forms of literature that were, or like storytelling that were enjoyed in the Germanic world, that which could be seen in the examples of the Icelandic sagas or in Anglo-Saxon poems like Beowulf. Those are completely different style of literature, and in Iceland they got replaced by romantic literature of the French type as well. So this style of literature became the fashion all around Europe. It's mostly of French origin, but there's Arthurian literature written in Britain, there's Arthurian literature written in Germany, and sometimes they add bits in, like like fanfic or whatever. It's kind of like that. Everyone thought King Arthur was a really cool story, and it was by no means limited to Britain. People, I'm sure, all over Europe were reading about King Arthur. I'm sure they were reading about him in Russia and his adventures. And he was an example of a Christian ideal in the High Middle Ages. And often there are morality tales where they sort of give examples of someone not being very Christian, and then the problem is solved by being more Christian, something like that. So just like Hollywood today, it's like you could think of Hollywood as being the center and France being its equivalent in the Middle Ages. It doesn't matter if the Hollywood film is set in Africa. It's still a Hollywood film. Now, King Arthur was set in Britain, but I mean, according to some of the Arthurian texts, he was the king of Scandinavia as well as Britain. So it's complete nonsense. This is not doesn't pertain to the reality of the real Arthur, if there ever was a real Arthur. So of course, it's no surprise that in Scotland they were naming things after Arthur. Like he was it was Superman, Spider-Man. I don't know whatever the equivalent is now, but everyone loved him.
We've touched on a few of these myths that have been, or in this case, historical reality, whichever way we're going to fall on that. But we've touched on the myths of the British Isles. Before we delve into Christianity and how that changed the culture, the psyche of the British peoples, what were the founding myths, I suppose, of the English in particular? So those derived from the Anglo-Saxons and perhaps even the Vikings. We could check into the mix.
Well, this is an interesting question because it sort of got disrupted. Initially, the Anglo-Saxon founding myth, as described by the Venerable Bede in the 8th century, pertains, what we can tell now from archaeology and genetics, exactly to the reality of their history. They remembered in the 8th century the factual events of their founding migration in the 5th century, and they built a mythos on that. It had been somewhat disrupted by the process of Christianization because, well, Bede's, who wrote it down for us, has built it into a Christian narrative. But it was a little bit difficult for him to do that because already when the Anglo-Saxons arrived in the 5th century, they were pagans. And so the mythic progenitors of their race, the Hengist and Horsa, the sons of the sons or grandsons of the top god Woden, were said to be among the early migrants, or even they are the first English people in Britain. Whereas we know from in Holland and other parts where they're referred to that these are actually gods, not people. So they became legendary ancestors integrated into the settlement process, where the gods participated in the colonization of Britain and legitimized that. Bede obviously can't go for that because he's Christian, but he also has a problem that he is defining the English identity in opposition to the identities of the previous inhabitants of Britain who were Christian. Yet he is also wanting to construct an English identity as Christian in opposition to paganism of people on the continent, like other Germanic people on the continent were still pagan. So he was precariously building through the ecclesiastical history of the English people, this idea of the English as simultaneously being not at all like the Christian inhabitants of England who were Celtic, but also being Christian. And he tries to dismiss some of the ideas of the earlier Christians having miscalculated Easter and things like that as being, significant. And that builds into a mythos that something called a Celtic church existed, which it never did. But the reality is that they were a pagan people who became Christian, not entirely because of the influence of Celts. Certainly in your part of the world, the Northumbrians were Christianized by Gaels from Ireland, Scotland, or from Iona specifically. And as a result, the Anglo-Saxon culture of the Northumbrians was extremely influential on the entire Celtic world, whereby people call them Celtic knots. This medieval artwork, they call it Celtic. It comes from Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons. It's a pagan Germanic form of art that were pagan Anglo-Saxons brought to Britain. But then when, in the process of Irish people Christianizing the Northumbrians, this style of pagan Germanic art became definitive of Christianity and Christian art in medieval British Isles, not only among Germanic people like Northumbrians, but also the Celtic people such as the Picts, the Britons, and the Gaels. So, the English founding myth was therefore this complicated mix of it couldn't be entirely based on Christianity because it had to be also in opposition to other Christian people. So it had to be focused on its unique Germanicness, but also it's not like Germanic continental. It has to be a new thing. And within, as a result of Bede writing that book, I think directly his political propaganda thereby of defining this idea of Englishness led into the actual formation of an English state, which was also contributed to by the invasion of the Vikings and the necessity of the consolidation of English powers to fight against them. But that mythos had, built up over the first 500 years of England's history, was again disrupted by the Norman invasion. And after the Norman times, like, English people had much more interest in King Arthur and Arthurian romance than they did in their own previous heroes that they used to celebrate, like Beowulf and Ingeld and like all, real Germanic heroes. Because but then later on, especially after the Reformation, Anglo-Saxonness becomes again a really big important part of Englishness, because many of the Protestant reformers saw the Anglo-Saxon past as a period of more devout non-Roman Christianity, which it wasn't. It was Roman Catholic as well. But they imagined it as being a period of more freedom for the common man without the Norman yoke. This is when the expression Norman yoke was developed. And this idea that there was a more liberal time in the Anglo-Saxons was very popular with the rising sort of not middle class, but like the equivalent of a middle class in parts of Eastern England. And this sort of momentum led up to the Civil War. But ever since then, of course, we've as included Anglo-Saxons as part of our history, as we originally did, until the 21st century, when people, or no, 20th century, sorry, early 20th century especially, some people started to question whether we were really Anglo-Saxons at all, and whether it was all just a mistake and Bede was making it up. And many people also, because of the success of the romantic revival of Celticness in the 19th century, which kind of just made up this completely non-existent sort of idea of a Celtic identity that never existed. That was very attractive and mystical, and still looms large in the British imagination, like the Celtic misty, like regions of the West Country and parts of Scotland seem to be more earthy and even more pagan than the East, which in the complete reverse is the truth. Like, the last part to be pagan, the British Isles, is the Isle of Wight, not the West Country or Scotland. But these all feature within our identity now. English identity has all these different currents feeding into it, but they're competing with each other. But modern genetics has reaffirmed the original narrative that Bede presented, and which many Victorian scholars were well aware of, and they said we have an Anglo-Saxon type, and they sometimes use such racial definitions to justify oppressing Scottish people. For example, in the Highland clearances, they would say that some people from Edinburgh, where you live now, would say that they were Anglo-Saxon. So people, they would describe themselves as belonging to the Anglo-Saxon race in Lower Scotland, whereas they would say the Highlanders were of an inferior racial type, destined to be, subjugated by the superior Anglo-Saxon type, which meant people from Lowland Scotland. Now, that is not justified by the genetics, but what is justified by the genetics is that the Anglo-Saxon invasion did occur, and the English people are distinct from other parts of the British Isles by having a greater degree of ancestry from continental North Europeans.
You've spoken a lot about the influence, I suppose, of Christianity on the Germanic peoples, but I also know, and it's something that I read about recently through, I think it was Oswald Spengler, who's talking about through the rise of the West, as it were, which is based upon Christianity, when it became the foundation of that civilization, and the decline of it was having lost sight of that. He said in that we often think that Europe and Northern Europe was Christianized, but actually Christianity was Germanized. And I think you've done some films that make that exact point, which is, and perhaps you can unpack it for us. How did the peoples of the Northwestern Europe, very different from those in I suppose the Middle East, end up taking on the Hebrew God, as it were?
There's a popular narrative, of the Germanization of Christianity, which was based on a book that came out in 1990 by J.C. Russell. And I have no doubt that there are survivals of Germanic culture in the Germanic countries after they became Christian. It's absolutely certain, because you see in the law code specifically that that the laws in early Christian Sweden, in early Christian Germany, even among the Lombards in Italy and in England, Anglo-Saxon in England, they still contained things that were trying to cope with the pre-existing culture of the Germanic peoples, which didn't just go away when they became Christian. They remained Germanic peoples with, like, for example, duties of revenge. And they didn't just say, now you're Christian, you're not allowed to take revenge on people. Instead, they had complicated ways of dealing with revenge and trying to discourage people from killing each other in revenge, for which is what Germanic people are supposed to do. But that, I think the book goes too far when it claims that Christianity itself in Europe has been changed somehow by Germanic people. I don't think that's true. And some of the things that, like, some people say, like, oh, it became a militant religion. Well, actually, it was already a militant religion because, first off, the Jews in the Old Testament are extremely violent. Secondly, it was the religion of the Roman Empire. And the Romans weren't exactly pacifists. They were extremely brutal people. So it was already, by the time it reached the Germanic people, it was already militarized. I mean, Constantine said, make of me, he saw that, use me as a weapon, or use me as a sword. He saw the cross in the sky, or this vision of Christianity for Rome, the Roman Empire. So if it hadn't have been militarized, it wouldn't have even reached the Germanic people probably in the first place. So I think they exaggerate that. But how did it spread across Northwest Europe is your question. Well, actually, the Romans brought it to Britain first. And there's a sort of like narrative which overlooks the nuances of the reality, where it says Romans brought it to Northwest Europe and it's been there ever since. Kind of, but actually not really, because after the Romans left, there wasn't a great deal of, I don't think Christianity was doing great in Britain. There were still some pockets of Celtic paganism, even at the time the Romans left. But Wales, the parts of Britain that really stayed very Christian, are the parts where the Romans didn't go. So, or the British Isles, rather. So Wales, which was not particularly Roman, didn't have a large Roman presence, was very important for the survival of Christianity in Northwest Europe, because Wales sent a mission to Ireland. St. Patrick was there. And then Ireland became vital for the survival of Christianity in Britain, because they set up the Columban monastery on Iona, from which missions were sent to the Picts to convert the Picts to Christianity, because the Romans never brought Christianity to the Picts. They sent a mission to Northumbria to make the Angles there Christian, and that was successful. And they sent also missions to their brother Gaels who had inhabited Scotland, because after the fall of Rome, Irish invaders called the Scotti invaded Scotland and settled. And those Scotti were not Christians. They were pagan Gaels living in Scotland. And but the Christian Gaels converted them. So 3 different races of Britain there converted by that mission. And at the same time, the Welsh were sending missions into southwest Britain, into Devon and Cornwall, where there had been survivals of Celtic paganism. And at this same time, Germanic pagans, the English, were coming in from the east and conquering all of England and bringing paganism back to Britain, a new type of paganism, Germanic paganism. But those Germanic Saxons were converted also from a mission from Rome. There was the Gregorian mission, as well as the Celtic missions from the north. So as a consequence, the Anglo-Saxons became one of the first properly Christianized Germanic peoples, although there had been, of course, long before the Anglo-Saxons, the Goths had been Christian, but they were Arian Christians, the Arian heresy, where they didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. And the Goths as people just disappeared from history because they all sort of blended in with all the different places they invaded in Iberia, Ukraine, wherever they went. But the Anglo-Saxons remained a Germanic people, and they kept their contacts with the Germanic world. And therefore, people like St. Boniface, who's from here in Devon, he felt it was his duty to go and convert preach to the Saxons on the continent, because they were his, racial brothers. They were Germanic people, and he wanted to bring the word of Christ to them to save them. So these kinds of missions that the Anglo-Saxons sent into the continent were very important, because, Saint Weilbach, also from Devon, she's now like the saint of a patron saint in Germany and Sweden. Boniface, of course, Willibrord, many Anglo-Saxon saints or preachers were going into Germany, Sweden, even Finland. Henry of Uppsala, he's called, who was in eastern Sweden. He was actually an Englishman who was sent from Sweden into Finland to go and preach even further. So there's knock-on effect. Once the Celtic people had succeeded in converting a Germanic people, the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons then went on to convert many other Germanic peoples. So it was not, you can't just say the Romans did it, because they really didn't. It could have gone a very different way than it did. It was the victory of Christianity in Northern Europe was not assured at all. And many people rejected it. And many Anglo-Saxon kings who converted then went back to being pagan because they thought it was better. Sweden wasn't even converted properly until like the 1200s or 1100s. So it's much, its power in the north was tenuous at times. And these Celtic monks living like, like St. Anthony on these little, as hermits on little islands here and there, somehow managed to change the course of history.
It is fascinating just how humble their beginnings were when you consider the impact they have. I mean, I've been to Iona and seen this one-person cell dug out at the top of this windy hill, and to think that there was quite a militaristic island kingdom there, which effectively incubated the likes of Aidan, who went on to found Lindisfarne, Holy Island, Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumberland, which then became a beacon within early Christendom. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. What do you make of the notion, which I think it was Peter Heather, who's a historian of the Roman Empire, he wrote a book called Christendom: The Rise and Triumph of a Religion, and he talks about the Saxons coming to Britain and says that, yes, whilst that ended up being a conquering, as it were, is that actually it didn't begin as a conquest. They were actually invited over by Romano-British elites who were feeling exposed after the fall of influence and support from Rome because of the imperial centre collapsing in and out around itself. Is that something you've come across in your research, that the Angles, the Saxons, were invited and then over time they became the de facto rulers, or was it more bloody or more benign than that?
That is one of the narratives presented in a near contemporary early medieval source, that the people were invited over. But those people that were invited over were Hengist and Horsa, who, as I said previously, were actually gods. So obviously, it's an anachronistic. It's not a real narrative. It's an apocryphal narrative of that time, which might have some truth into it. We'll never know for sure. It's perfectly possible that, like, as I said, like, it wasn't just the Anglos on the eastern shore, the Saxon shore, as the Romans called it. It was always a risk of Germanic invasions. But the western shore was also, the Welsh were afraid of Irish invasions. The Irish were the Scoti were like a scare, as much a fearsome invading race as the Saxons were. So sometimes they wanted protection from that. So they might say, oh, maybe we'll get these, or the Picts for that matter. Like, the wall of Hadrian's Wall had been there to protect Britain from the Picts, but then when the Romans are gone, it's like there's a free for all. So it's like the idea of like there was one Celtic world. There wasn't. There was all these different Celtic tribes, and maybe one tribe did think maybe a few Saxon soldiers could be helpful right now. And then once the Saxons arrived, they might decide not to leave. They could take over the whole place. But something like that could have taken a part of the narrative. But I suspect the overall narrative of settlement was much bigger and can't be condensed into such a small thing, because it's significant. They're looking at like the eastern side of England. The initial migration would have, they think it replaced approximately 80% of the population there. So that can't be just a few, that's not a few mercenaries. That's that's families. That's a mass scale migration. And then that 80% replacement in the east was then like blended into the rest of the country as the English moved westwards, so that we don't have the 80% continental ancestry now. It's only about half at most.
You touched on the rivalries, the warfare between different Celtic peoples, tribes, and I think what's quite a prevalent view in the modern day is that the history of the English is one of invasion and subjugation of the innocent peoples, the innocent Celtic peoples, Brittonic peoples of the British Isles. You've touched on the fact that some of these peoples were not exactly shrinking violets when it came to warfare. I think, yes, it's probably fair to say that England's managed to gain a level of military and technological supremacy through, from the conquest onwards, perhaps before that. But what would you say about the notion that it was a one-way street, that ultimately it was the English peoples always seeking to subjugate, or is it, as ever, more nuanced than that?
It's more nuanced, of course. It's always more nuanced. In history, you can always say to someone in response to anything they say, well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, and you'll always be correct. So it's like a bit of an annoying thing to say, because you can say at any given point. But the nuances go on and on, because reality is always nuanced. If you go to a party and give an account of it, there's no account that you could give that couldn't be more nuanced, because there's always so many little things that could have happened. But the fact is, yes, like sometimes, just give an example, just to like sort of disrupt that narrative. Sometimes the pagan English were allied with Christian Celtic peoples against Christian English. So, you know what I mean? Like a king of an Edwin of Northumbria is a king, a pagan, a Christian, and he was fighting against, I think it was Penda, who was allied with some Celtic Britons. And then later on, after the English are all Christian, that's the Vikings come. And then you think, oh, well, who are the pagan Vikings going to ally with? Well, sometimes they ally with Christian Celts against English people. It's not so much like Christian versus pagan or Celtic versus Germanic. It's more just like little kingdoms who are willing to make alliances with anyone if they can win against the enemy they happen to have at that given moment.
Okay. Well, that's something that I think I was expecting you to say. It is something that I find frustrating. Not that I find it frustrating because I'm some jingoistic, Anglophile that suggests there are no skeletons in the closet of the English people. I also have some Scottish in me too, and so I have sympathy for all of the British peoples, really. But I always find it quite remarkable when I hear people suggest that there is almost nothing good, and that it's only ever been a one-way street, as though, for example, I think the Irish, because of I suppose the Cromwellian absolute subjugation of them, which is going to really, really rankle them in the plantations for sure. But I think the notion that the Irish were just an innocent peoples is something that I've always found to be far-fetched. And this isn't trying to attach any kind of everlasting sin on a nation at all. But I think it's interesting that when you look into the genetics, and as you've alluded to, Anatolian people from modern-day Turkey came to these isles, and I think Ireland, particularly all of the men, are descended from Anatolian folks who arrived and effectively put the Irish men out of business.
Well, I mean, in this respect, Ireland is in no way unique at all, but for having Anatolian ancestry. Everyone in Europe is between 75 and half of descended from the farmers of Neolithic Europe, who themselves have an Anatolian origin. But the actual replacements that came, I mean, all Irish people, like all British people and all Germanic and Celtic people in Northwest Europe, all have significant ancestry from the Indo-Europeans, and their paternal lineages all come from them, not from Anatolia. It's very rare that anyone in Northern Europe has their paternal lineages of Anatolian origin. They rather have Eastern European paternal lineages, and that's what Ireland is associated with now. This Eastern European, Indo-European steppe component of R1b or R1a haplogroups mainly. But the Irish are continued that warrior cult. The Irish, like the Germanic tribes and the Celtic tribes, all of them continued this warrior culture of the ancient Indo-Europeans. which was often focused on cattle herding and things like that. The Irish, being industrial, simultaneously, Irish are interesting because they're simultaneously one of these very early Christian peoples who adopted Christianity so early on in history. And in that sense, you would see them as being more civilized and being one of the more advanced peoples of Europe. But also at the same time, they had the Industrial Revolution so late, and they often depended on like pastoralist kind of economies, high amounts of dairy, risk of famine, very violent internecine conflicts, the clan-based systems, which are actually very old-fashioned sort of Bronze Age ways of living. So they're sort of, it's interesting that Ireland are both those things at the same time. It's hard to imagine why. I mean, the Normans used to say, I think some of the Normans said that the Irish had green skin. So even like as recently as that time in history, 1,000 years ago, the Irish still had this almost mythical quality. They're like, not, like pigs, green skinned monster people or something. Like no one really knew what they were, and their belief that they lived entirely off milk and stuff like this. But those were probably exaggerations of the reality. But it just shows that like Ireland's quite an enigma in that sense. It's not easily defined. It is different from the rest of the British Isles, different from the rest of Europe. But yes, they're not. We're a warrior race. So yes, they were oppressed by the English people, but Cromwell particularly, and they suffered badly under the potato famines. But they historically didn't view themselves as victims because they were colonizers. They invaded Scotland, the Scoti invaded, and they also did slave raids. They took like slaves from Cornwall, even in places like that, Wales and Cornwall. And it's believed Sir Patrick was made a slave in Ireland, So they were slavers and warriors and fighters, and still are. Some of them quite keen on fighting, I understand.
Tom, we've talked a lot about the movement of peoples, and I think the most talked about thing in modern Britain today is pace of immigration. We have had extraordinarily large numbers arrive on these shores in the last 30 years. And last year alone, I think 1.2 million, and then you subtract the 500,000 that left, and that's 700,000 is the net figure, but 1.2 million new people. And often you will find folks set their stall out and say, well, we shouldn't get too worried about this because ultimately the history of humanity is one of movement. And so this is a bit of an open, giving you the field to expound on the genetic settlement, I suppose, and the cultural settlement and the periods, the long periods of time that has taken place here on the British Isles. Because I've seen you make reference to a few things within your videos, like, for example, people will point to the Elizabethan period and talk about how there were Muslim traders that I think you mentioned were called blackamoors, but even this paled in comparison to the population of 4 million. There were 340 traders, and maybe only 12 of them were there at any one time. And then there was a wave of a couple of hundred Italians every year for 170 years or something, and then a one-time influx of Huguenots as they were escaping persecution in France. Could you just tell us a little bit about why the notion that immigration shouldn't worry us? It's just at this scale because people are just people. They move around. They become those people over time. What's behind that, and what the picture really looks like?
Yes, that expression and that mode of arguing is disingenuous and depends on a truism. Like, you can say that tides have always existed, but if a tidal wave happens, that doesn't really. You can't tell someone as a tidal wave approaching, well, tides have always existed, or waves have always existed. This is something different. It's not the same thing. Geneticists have shown, I talk about all these different ancient migrations, and it's easy for someone to interpret that to say, oh, we really are a mongrel bunch, aren't we? We're a mix of all this. But actually, all of the different peoples that contributed were all Northwest Europeans, like the Angles, the Saxons, the Celts, the Gaels, whatever. They're all Northwest Europeans. The Belgica folk, the first Indo-Europeans to come to Britain 4,500 years ago, came from Holland. We are an indigenous Northwest European people. All the peoples, the 5 peoples of the British Isles are indigenous Northwest European peoples. other migrations are insignificant. The only significant migrations historically have been going backwards. The Bell-Beaker migration. First you've got the native, you've got the hunter-gatherers, and you've got 6,000 years ago the first farmers come. 4,500 years ago the Bell-Beaker Indo-Europeans come. 3,000 years ago Celts, and that's quite a small migration compared to the others, and then the Anglo-Saxons. The Romans don't even count as a big thing because they didn't actually change the gene pool. And none of the subsequent migrations have contributed very much to the overall gene pool. They've not really changed anything. So it's disingenuous to talk about, oh, well, there was this one guy who came in the Elizabethan era. It was a black guy or whatever. Well, yeah, so what? It doesn't really change who we are. It doesn't change the makeup of the country or the history of that of who we are. They're trying to distort things. And the idea to say we're a mongrel people or a mutts or whatever, which is insulting. Compared to who is that meant to be? Because actually, what genetics has shown, the modern population genetics, is that Northwest Europe is characterized by genetic stability over long periods of time, not instability, where other parts of the world are extremely always in flux with constant movements of different people replacing each people. There have been replacements here, but they're happening over the course. We have to talk about over the course of a 5,000-year span to talk about them. They don't happen on the way they're happening now. In the last 20 years, more people have come to this country than have come in the previous 2,000 years. So it's like that's not. You can't really talk about it anywhere near the same. It's not at all equivalent. It's complete false equivalency. And to try to use like the fact that we descend from Anglo-Saxons as a justification for hordes of unwelcome migrants who will, not contribute to the economy, who will be a net negative to our way of life, who will cause the house prices to rise, wages to go lower, and to say we should welcome that because 1,500 years ago some Germanic warriors sailed over with sword in hand to conquer new lands. There's no connection to those events. It's completely dishonest to try and make them seem equivalent somehow. This is our country, so we should decide who can and can't come in. And the fact that we descend from people who have their origins elsewhere doesn't in any way distinguish from anyone else in the world. All peoples have always moved. All peoples have always mixed to some extent. But the mixes have happened naturally as two peoples. You have one people who lived in this country for thousands of years, then the new people move in, and then gradually over the course of hundreds of years, the two people, there's a synthesis achieved and they mix together. What you don't get is hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world crammed into one city and then expected suddenly to create a new people. That's never happened before, and it's not going to happen. It's not. There's no consensus to reach. There's nothing that they agree on. They've got nothing in common. There's no actual agreed culture that they can all center themselves on. Even the Roman Empire, which successfully had, some kind of, it managed to incorporate the various peoples of the Mediterranean into it, and they came into Italy and mixed. But they all centered on the Roman culture. They all became Roman. So even Greek-speaking Arabs in the Levant worshipped Zeus. Even though they were that made it possible. Now there's no common culture. There's no common agreement on anything, and people aren't even willing to assert that there is such a thing as an English culture anyway. So how can you possibly expect these immigrants to assimilate to something that the authorities don't even say exists? So it's absolutely hopeless.
Yeah, you have spoken about how people do, and if anyone goes and reads into it, you'll find that argument you made, which is people think because there was an invasion of the Anglo-Saxons, which is at the root of the English nation as we know it today, and the peoples, then that effectively is a carte blanche for just allowing new peoples to arrive en masse. But yet, in the same token, you will find that those same people are the people that are in the academic sphere currently trying to change or even erase the notion that Anglo-Saxons existed before. I can't remember what term it is they've alighted on, but it's something like early English, perhaps. I don't know what they're referring to it as, but they knock the foundations out from beneath their own argument by doing that. Tom, I think there are many things that we could understand might be common objections to your work when you're ultimately talking about the cultural uniqueness of the peoples of the Northwest Europe in an age of multiculturalism and mass immigration. You have done an awful lot, both in your working life, you've done an awful lot in your academic life, and been exposed to lots of information, history, culture, genetics. So I suspect that the stage is probably set for you to have had quite a few changes in outlook. And one question I like to ask all of my guests who come on to the show is, what is something that you have changed your mind about that you once thought was set in stone, perhaps even a good thing, but that you since changed your mind on, and why? What was it that made you change your mind?
Oh, I change my mind on things all the time when new evidence comes out. I go with what the consensus of evidence shows. So when new evidence comes, often you have to rearrange your beliefs. There was a kind of narrative that was popularized by Maria Gimbutas that the Neolithic Europeans who existed prior to the Indo-Europeans were well, she actually went so far as to say they were matriarchal. I never believed that they are matriarchal, but I did believe perhaps that they were relatively more egalitarian than the Indo-Europeans. But like when we look closely now at like evidence, genetic evidence and other archaeological evidence, it's very clear that they were also highly stratified society, perhaps even more socially stratified than in the European society, patriarchal, based on ruled by dynasties of divine lineage dynasties of male, patrilineally defined, of sometimes inbred god kings who were interred in these magnificent megalithic monuments of the Neolithic. So they were more akin to something like ancient Egypt, than any kind of feminist egalitarian utopia that some mid 20th century authors imagined. So that was, that's been constantly adjusting my view of them. That they were warriors, they were murderers, they were killers, they were not peaceniks of any sort. Although I never fully bought into that narrative anyway. But I mean, now it's just it's going to be completely demolished. It just doesn't have any basis at all. Similarly, I've always been a little bit curious about to what extent Christianity survived among the Brythonic peoples of England after the fall of Rome, because there are narratives, especially perpetuated by the church, that it was always Christian. There was always Christianity, and that the worshippers of Woden were just a minor, bump in the road, and it would continue Christianity. But I didn't see a lot of evidence for that. In fact, I thought the other way. I thought it was quite likely that Christianity was completely eliminated in the southeastern parts of Britain when the Anglo-Saxon came, and then only came and had to be reintroduced. If it didn't have to be reintroduced, then why would Rome have sent a mission to England? Why would the Gaels have sent missions to England if there was constant Christian presence? It seems now that there's quite good evidence that actually, especially in burials, like the women, because the Germanic migrants were marrying into native families. And it seems very often you had mixed religious marriages, where sometimes a pagan man would marry a Christian woman, and you could have a household perhaps with both religions in it existing, and maybe it seems that Christianity in early medieval England was more popular with women, and that women played a crucial role in the survival of Christianity in Britain, in South Britain anyway, which is very interesting, and it would not be initially what I'd thought, but this kind of thing. Yeah, I'm always willing to change my mind on things.
Well, I think there could be a use for that amongst the rest of us, and the general population can become far too stuck in the mud and refuse to see things when they come across our gaze. Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure. Before I let you go, you do have the substantial footprint online. Perhaps you can tell everyone where they can find you, and if there's anything that you're working on that you're excited about that we can expect to see in the coming months.
My YouTube channel is where most of my stuff happens. That's YouTube Survive the Jive. And I also have another channel, Jive Talks, for live streams if you want to see me just chatting like I've been here today. But the Survive the Jive channel is for edited documentaries, often filmed on location around Europe and other parts of the world. I am going to do a video on the genetic ancestry of Trump and how that might have contributed to his nature. That'll be out soon enough, I hope. Next year, I'm going to Iceland. I'm going to do a documentary about Iceland's landscape and how it features large in medieval Icelandic literature of the Vikings, the sagas. And I also hope maybe to do a sort of intrepid trip and go into Central Asia, parts of Russia, where some of the ancient remains and archaeological remains of the Aryans can be found. That's on the cards too. But yeah, please check out my channel, Survive the Jive, and you'll see lots of interesting documentary films you can see for free.
Absolutely, I can stand behind that. It's interesting, it's funny, and I would be very surprised if you weren't able to find history about your own ancestry, so everyone should go and check that out. Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to talk to you again in the future, and I know you're headed off for your lunch now, so bon appetito when you get sat down at the table.
Thanks a lot, John.
Take care. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.